Realm of Ruins, Chapter 5. Catherine. The village of Bear Creek stood nestled at the foot of towering pines, a sanctuary carved from the wilderness by hands long gone. Its timber and stone houses clung to the earth like moss to the ancient rocks, their roofs thick with green moss and straw. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, carrying with it the scents of fresh bread, pine wood, and the faint metallic tang of iron from the blacksmith's forge. The forest loomed tall and watchful around the village, its shadows deep and cool, under the midday sun, while a meandering creek sparkled as it wove through the village like a vein of life. Catherine stood on the western balcony of the castle, her gaze sweeping across the town below. The fortress behind her was an unyielding silhouette of stone and history, its walls thick with ivy that clung to the cold rock, as if seeking warmth. Her leather bodice creaked softly as she adjusted her stance, leaning forward against the balcony's edge. Her silver braid, threaded with faint streaks of ash blonde, gleamed in the light, cascading over her shoulder in a deliberate mark of her composure and authority. The lands below were her life's work, though they belonged to her husband's name. Bear Creek owed its prosperity to the unity of the people, who had learned to endure the seasons, the beasts of the wild, and the distant demands of the king. It was a place where hardship was shared and survival was a collective art. Catherine's green eyes lingered on the village square, where the elders and children bustled about with purpose. She recognized the boy driving a stubborn ox toward the grain house, his small shoulders squared against the animal's size. Women in plain wool dresses hurried from one stall to another, their arms laden with bundles of herbs and early summer harvests. This village was alive, breathing in rhythm with the changing seasons, and yet it felt vulnerable. Without Beorn and the strength of his leadership, everything seemed tenuous. He had always been a towering figure, not just in stature but in presence, the kind of man whose mere existence could steady an unspoken fear. Catherine could almost hear his deep voice now, filled with that steady, commanding tone that reassured her in moments when she didn't even know she needed it. He had left with their two sons, Boris and Corey, marching north to fight in a war that felt as distant and irrelevant to Bear Creek as the stars themselves. Her fingers tightened against the cold stone. She missed them fiercely, though she would never admit it aloud, not to her people, and not even to herself in moments of solitude. Boris, the eldest, was a mirror of his father, serious and dutiful, with a strong jaw and a steady gaze that could quiet a room. Corey was different, restless, quick with a smile that could charm even the hardest heart. He had his father's cunning, but wore it loosely, like a cloak. He could shrug off whenever it suited him. Catherine's lips pressed into a thin line. She worried for them both in different ways. Boris would die for his duty. Corey would risk everything for his freedom. And Beorn, he carried the weight of them all on his broad shoulders. But she wasn't there to share it with him. Instead, she was here, holding together the fraying threads of Bear Creek, while the men she loved risked their lives far from home. A breeze stirred the air, carrying with it the scent of pine and damp earth. Catherine closed her eyes for a moment, letting it wash over her. The forest had always been her sanctuary, but now it felt like an encroaching shadow. She opened her eyes again, focusing on the village and its people. They were her purpose now. If she faltered, they would falter. And if they faltered, Bear Creek would fall. A soft knock at the oak door behind her broke her thoughts. She turned, her composure snapping into place like a shield. "Enter," she called, her voice firm and steady. The door opened to reveal Kedrick, her steward. His face, as always, was calm and unreadable, though his hands betrayed a subtle nervousness as they smoothed the front of his tunic. My lady, he began, bowing his head slightly, the village elders are gathered in the great hall. They await your guidance. Catherine nodded, brushing a strand of her braid over her shoulder as she stepped past him. Let us not keep them waiting, she said, her tone brooking no hesitation. The great hall was a cavernous space, its high beams darkened with centuries of smoke and age. Tapestries hung along the walls, depicting the battles and victories of House Balon. The light from the flickering torches cast long, dancing shadows across the stone floor, where villagers had gathered in cautious groups. Farmers stood shoulder to shoulder with craftsmen, their faces lined with worry. As Catherine stepped into the room, the murmurs fell silent. She met their gazes one by one, her own expression unwavering. An elder stepped forward, a weathered man named Edric, whose gnarled hands still bore the strength of a farmer who had spent his life shaping the land. He bowed deeply before speaking. Lady Catherine, may the gods watch over your husband and all our sons. And over us, Catherine replied evenly. Speak, Edric. What troubles you? The old man shifted his weight, his voice trembling slightly. The fields, my lady. They grow wild, and our hands are too few. Winter will come sooner than we think. And without the harvest, he trailed off, the unspoken fear hanging heavy in the air. Hilda, a sharp-eyed woman with a voice that carried, stepped forward next. It's the wolves, she said bluntly. Every night they grow bolder. They've already taken sheep from the northern pens. It's only a matter of time before they come closer. Too close. Catherine listened in silence, her sharp mind piecing together the concerns like a puzzle. When they had finished, she stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The wolves will be dealt with, she said firmly. Hunters will patrol the edges of the forest, traps will be set, and the herds will be moved closer to the village, where they can be better guarded. She turned her gaze to Edric. As for the fields, we will tend them together. Every able-bodied villager will work to bring in the harvest. We will prepare for winter, as we always have, with resolve and unity. Bear Creek will not falter, not while we stand. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, though the shadows of doubt remained in their eyes. Catherine knew she could not erase their fears entirely, but she could give them direction, purpose. As the villagers filed out of the hall, their whispers fading into the corridors beyond, Catherine remained where she stood, her thoughts heavy. She turned at last to Cedric, who had lingered near the door. "Where is my daughter?" she asked, her voice quieter now, though no less resolute. Cedric hesitated, his usually calm expression faltering for just a moment. "I'm not certain, my lady," he admitted, his hands smoothing the front of his tunic again, a nervous habit Catherine had long since noted. Her brows knitted together, the faintest flicker of unease passing over her composed features. She dismissed it with a slow, deliberate breath, her voice steady once more. "Find her," she said, the command firm but not harsh. "I will not have her wandering without a word." Catherine strode out of the great hall, her composure unbroken, as she left the whispers of the villagers behind. The weight of their concerns lingered with her, but she carried it as she always did, with grace and determination. She climbed the winding stone staircase back to her chambers, her footsteps echoing softly in the narrow corridor. Once inside, she closed the heavy oak door behind her and let out a quiet sigh, the kind only the walls of her room were allowed to hear. The room was dimly lit, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. Catherine moved to the small writing desk near the window, her fingers brushing over the stack of parchment and quill waiting for her attention, but her mind was elsewhere. She leaned against the edge of the desk, staring out at the forest beyond the village as thoughts of Thera took hold. Her daughter had always been a firebrand, a force of nature that refused to be contained. Even as a child, Thera had shown an uncanny fearlessness that often left Catherine torn between pride and exasperation. She remembered the day Thera had first climbed the ancient oak tree in the castle courtyard, a tree so tall its branches stretched far beyond the walls. Catherine had found her perched near the top, her small face beaming with triumph as she waved down at her mother. "What are you doing up there, Thyra?" Catherine had called, trying to keep her voice calm despite the fear tightening in her chest. "Seeing the world, Mother," Thyra had replied, her voice filled with laughter. "It's much bigger up here." Catherine had hurried to fetch a servant to help her coax Thyra down, but the memory lingered even now, the way Thyra had looked so unafraid, so utterly at home in the sky. There had been countless moments like that, times when Thyra's boldness had shone through her every action, while other girls in the village had been content to play with dolls or weave garlands of flowers. Thyra had insisted on joining the boys in their mock battles, wooden swords clashing as she matched them strike for strike. Catherine had watched her from the castle walls, her heart swelling with pride even as a quiet voice in the back of her mind whispered warnings. The world was not kind to girls like Thyra. It demanded they conform, that they lower their heads and accept the roles dictated to them. But Thyra had never bowed to those expectations. She had always stood taller, walked straighter, her green eyes blazing with a defiance that Catherine both admired and feared. It wasn't just the village that worried her. Catherine had seen the way some of the castle's knights had looked at Thyra as she grew older, not with malice, but with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. They weren't used to women who carried themselves with such confidence, who wielded a wooden sword as naturally as they did their steel ones. Catherine knew those looks could one day turn dangerous, and the thought made her chest tighten. Still, she couldn't bring herself to smother Thyra's spirit. She had seen too much of herself in her daughter, the same hunger for freedom, the same unwillingness to bend. Catherine had been different in her youth as well, though she had learned to temper her wildness with the sharp edges of responsibility. Would Thyra learn to do the same, or would the world try to break her before she had the chance? Catherine moved to the bed and sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The room felt quieter than usual, the absence of her family pressing down on her. She thought of Beorn, of Boris and Corey, and how they would have laughed at Thyra's antics. Corey especially would have encouraged her, likely joining in her mischief and earning a stern reprimand from his father for it. And yet, Catherine knew there was a strength in Thyra that even her brothers didn't possess. It wasn't just courage, it was something deeper, an unyielding belief in herself that seemed unshakable. Perhaps that was why Catherine worried so much. Thyra was not the kind to retreat, to back down from a fight, but the world outside Bear Creek was full of battles far more dangerous than wooden swords and imaginary foes. She stood and crossed to the window, her gaze once again falling on the forest. Somewhere out there her daughter was likely chasing adventure, her laughter echoing through the trees. Catherine's lips curved into a small, bittersweet smile. "Wherever you are, Thyra," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the faint rustle of the wind. "I hope the gods watch over you." Thank you for tuning in to Realm of Ruins. Don't forget to like and follow to keep the story going.